How did religious conservatives and the radical right take over America? Ann Nelson explained it all in her book, Shadow Network. Check this out. This is TenOnReligion. Hey peeps, it's Dr. B with TenOnReligion. If you like religion and philosophy content, go ahead and hit that sub button because it really helps out the channel. Also, if you find this content interesting, drop me a super thanks. The transcript is available at TenOnReligion.com, and new episodes are on the way, so drop me some views. How did religious conservatives take over America? Ann Nelson provides an excellent description of how this process happened in her 2019 book, Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right. Through her research, she discovered the ties connecting the manpower and media of the Christian right with the finances of the Western wealthy class and the strategy of right-wing Republican political operatives. Many of their connections were made through a secretive organization called the Council for National Policy. The CNP was founded in 1981 by a small group of arch-conservatives who realized that the tides of history had turned against them. They represented an American past dominated by white Protestant male property owners. They dreamed of restoring a 19th century patriarchy that limited the civil rights of women, minorities, immigrants, and workers with no income tax to vex the rich or social safety net to aid the poor. They spent decades building a framework to advance their agenda through a sophisticated strategy, including the creation of a parallel universe of information. The CNP and its allies spent years building party machines at a state level. The CNP set its sights on the Republican Party, conducting a decades-long crusade to promote right-wing extremists and drive moderates out of office. How did they do this? Let's get into it. Some background. Way back in the Civil War, the South argued its God-given entitlement to states' rights in continuing to impose their legal right to slavery. The Baptists split when leaders in northern states refused to appoint southern leaders whose families had owned slaves. The southern leaders separated and founded the Southern Baptist Convention. Over 100 years later in the 1960s, despite the non-Hispanic white population dropping from 90 to 60% and the Protestant population dropping to less than half, a sizable contingent of fundamentalists believed that God had still chosen them to impose His will on the nation. But something interesting happened in the Southern Baptist Convention. There was a strong belief in authoritarian principles stemming from their linking biblical inerrancy to theocracy. When applied politically, they supported a literal interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, restricting its meaning to the original intent. The trouble with this is, in either religion or politics, even if there is an authoritative text, there can never be an authoritative interpretation for all time because human experiences across time and geographical regions are different. But back in the Southern Baptist Convention, the fundamentalist leaders learned how to achieve minority rule through long-term strategies, and they took over the domination. They would later apply this method to the entire country to manipulate the electoral process and reshape the judicial branch of government. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court ended public school prayer, and in the 1970s, the IRS under the Nixon administration ended tax exemption for all schools and colleges, which did not end segregation in their institutions. This enraged conservative fundamentalists who wanted to keep people of color out of their schools. Then two men, Paige Patterson and Paul Pressler, joined forces to lead a fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. Ironically, Pressler was a known child molester and sexually assaulted a number of young boys. This was followed in the 1970s when Southern Baptist preacher Jerry Falwell invited pastors to a meeting with a Republican named Paul Weyrich, who shortly thereafter founded three organizations which would become key building blocks of the radical right. The first was the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing think tank. The second was the Republican Study Committee, which sponsored an influential Republican lunch club on Capitol Hill. The third was the American Legislative Exchange Council, which provided an organizational leadership for the Republicans to gain the upper hand in state governments. Oil and gas industries, pharmaceutical corporations, tobacco companies, and others flocked to ALEC conferences, paid up, and then emerged with their rewards. Weyrich and other fundamentalist leaders wanted to offer the Southern Baptists a path to theocracy through the electoral process. The name for the new movement was the Moral Majority. A key moment in its early history occurred at a 1980 meeting in Dallas when Weyrich said, "Elections are not won by a majority of people. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down." In other words, suppressing opposition voters was as critical as engaging supporters. They focused on limiting the power of the federal government, strengthening state government, and installing sympathetic judges to the federal courts. By 1980, Weyrich's complex machine was under construction with the Heritage Foundation to program policy, the Republican Study Committee to elicit congressional votes, the American Legislative Exchange Council to draft state-level legislation, and the Moral Majority to mobilize the masses. In the summer of 1980, the Moral Majority gave presidential hopeful candidate Ronald Reagan their full support as he ran for office using the slogan, "Let's make America great again." He won that fall, and in the following spring, a man named Richard Viguerie, who had hired Paul Weyrich some years earlier to run a conservative direct mail campaign, came together with 50 other conservatives to found the Council for National Policy. They would meet 2 to 3 times a year in fancy hotels with a secret membership and a secret radical right-wing political agenda. One of their first strategic initiatives was to bypass the national news media to disseminate their own media messages and thus control the conversation regarding the social issues in society. This started with radio and then later television. The Fairness Doctrine was a law that had been in effect since 1949, requiring radio and television broadcasters to devote airtime on controversial matters to both sides of an issue. By 1987, this was intentionally gutted by Reagan's administration, which opened the door for CNP media partners' highly politicized, one-sided broadcasts. All current events could now be filtered and communicated through an extremely partisan fundamentalist lens, unrestricted by the normal professional practices of multi-sourced reporting, fact-checking, and corrections. This gave rise to extreme right-wing hosts such as Rush Limbaugh, Hugh Hewitt, and Sean Hannity. The Council for National Policy focused on creating and then building out a parallel universe of organizations to carry out conservative, strategic goals. They emphasized framing an issue through language that would excite the emotions, such as talking about guns, abortion, or family and gender issues. The CNP set the agenda, the donors channeled the funding, the operatives coordinated the messaging, and the media partners broadcasted it obediently. They were relentless in helping their friends and punishing their enemies. There was little interest in engaging Democrats in constructive debate or reaching across the aisle. Why? Because they were the elect, chosen by God to set the nation on His path. One CNP leader, Morton Blackwell, wrote to a friend in 1998 stating, "You can't count on the news media to communicate your message to your constituency. You must develop ways to communicate with your coalition which avoid the filters of the media." The main money donors to the CNP were wealthy families such as the Koch brothers from Kansas and the Dick and Betsy DeVos family from Michigan. They joined their political platforms together to use the CNP for their causes as well. Their challenge was this: try to orchestrate the mechanisms of American democracy and media to convince voters to support candidates who would compromise the safety of their water, soil, and air, and limit their families' access to health care and public education. This task would require all the strengths of American corporate culture, including strategy, messaging, and marketing. A group of organizations came together to work towards these goals, including the National Christian Foundation, a donor network comprised of affluent evangelicals. Because some pastors were not entirely comfortable preaching politics in their sermons to their church congregations, conservative evangelical psychologist James Dobson's Family Research Council provided a menu of arguments and workarounds for pastors to use. Conservative organizations created voter guides in which children's welfare was only mentioned prior to birth. After birth, conservatives didn't seem to care what happened. So much for pro-life. Then things turned directly to the political sphere. The fundamentalists held the Senate because it allotted disproportionate representation in sparsely populated states, which were fundamentalist strongholds. The CNP and the Koch brothers had their donors invest millions in state and local political campaigns to take over state governments, where decisions on redistricting and gerrymandering were made. These were later decided by the courts. District court judges, circuit judges, and Supreme Court justices are all nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and together the three courts had the power to transform American society. The CNP developed three legal organizations to assist in their long-term strategic plans: the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Federalist Society, and the American Center for Law and Justice. The Alliance Defending Freedom helped local pastors and activists get free legal aid for conservative causes. The Federalist Society promoted an originalist interpretation of the U.S. Constitution to cultivate conservative views in judges with enormous success. 6 of the 9 current Supreme Court justices are current or former members of the Federalist Society. And lastly, the American Center for Law and Justice was created to argue high-profile cases in court which championed conservative causes. Since this entire trajectory first got its roots as a reaction to slavery and the civil rights movement, they were not surprisingly both appalled and horrified when President Obama won the 2008 election. The next year, the Koch brothers launched their own voter database. They aligned with the CNP to develop a massive funding base and long-term connections with organizations such as the National Rifle Association and large megachurches. Their digital strategy was fully integrated into their own dedicated media sphere of broadcast and online platforms. In 2012, conservatives again ran into a snag because up to a quarter of Republicans were not willing to vote for a Mormon, in this case Mitt Romney. The CNP was then determined to purge the Republican Party of anyone not on board with their conservative takeover plans. In the months leading up to the 2016 election, the CNP preferred candidate was conservative Texas Senator Ted Cruz, but Donald Trump won the primaries. The Shadow Network then faced a choice: either let Hillary Clinton win or embrace Trump. If the Republicans won the presidency and retained the Senate, they would hold the power to reshape the American judiciary for an entire generation, since presidential judges' appointments were lifetime appointments. Decisions on gerrymandering would set the scales for many elections to come. Their aspirations would no longer be limited by the system of checks and balances designed by the founders to guard against extremism. The fundamentalists measured a man's worth by his church attendance, marital fidelity, and knowledge of the Bible, and Trump came up short on every count. But the Republican Party was the coalition's only path to power, and whatever Trump's failings, its leadership held Hillary Clinton to be the greater evil, so they were forced to embrace Trump. The fundamentalists reconciled Trump's character with their goals by defining him not as a man of God, but as an instrument of God. His task was to destroy democracy so they could take over and run the country with their values. The organizations narrowed their issues down to 5: abortion, same-sex marriage, Supreme Court appointments, limited government, and religious liberty, which meant the freedom to run the country with their ultra-conservative interpretation of Christianity. These outlets pursued a relentless campaign to erode trust in professional news organizations. The crusade was taken to church sanctuaries. The partner organizations delivered sermon notes to thousands of churches. Rather than trying to sell congregations on Donald Trump's virtues, the fundamentalist campaign preached the evils of his opposition. Abortion became a centerpiece of the Republican campaign, far eclipsing policies that affected the health and welfare of those children already born. The CNP and Koch operations disciplined the Republican Party to a high degree of unity by rewarding the compliant and purging the disobedient, and devoted serious resources to state-level politics. These efforts paid off. Trump's first term was ultimately about money in the form of the Republican tax bill. On December 22, 2017, Trump signed the bill into law, giving massive tax cuts to the wealthy and to corporations, paving the way for a record federal deficit. A third of the corporate tax cuts benefited the top 1% of the population, while 70% went to the top 20%. Trickle-down economics is simply code for the rich to get richer. This entire strategy is to manipulate voters to vote against their own economic interests by deflecting the message towards these lesser important social issues. Let's see. Do I want to be able to afford health care, food, and housing for myself and my family, or help the rich get richer? Let's focus on guns and same-sex marriage and abortion, even though we don't ever care or talk about what happens to babies after they're born. Tough choice, right? The CNP then focused on the 2018 midterm elections, turning the voters away from the traditional news media and pointing them toward media generated by the Family Research Council, American Family Media, and the Christian Broadcasting Network. The Family Research Council provided a fat binder for pastors, including instructions on how to help their congregations. On June 19, the New York Times' Hiroko Tabuchi described how the Koch brothers' ground troops and the Koch network's technology converged in a story on AFP's campaign to defeat public transit activities so more people will buy gasoline. For the record, the Koch brothers own and operate enormous oil, gas, and mining companies. The Founding Fathers' system of checks and balances placed the legislative, administrative, and judicial branches as counterweights to each other, but they may not have anticipated a prolonged assault on every institution at once. The United States is a large and complex society, and its leaders face urgent decisions concerning climate change, public health, and education, and international conflict. How can the country envision the reduction of its entire future to a litmus test on abortion and same-sex marriage, which were debated under false premises in conservative media outlets? On the Democratic side, the party faces a generational divide between the traditional white men who have run the party in the past and a newly energized generation that reflects the growing diversity of the nation. Both of these camps have been slow to grasp the realities of the new electoral map. Meanwhile, the Republican strategy had the impact of the massive targeted get-out-the-vote efforts conducted by CNP and Koch partners, combined with a multi-platform media, advertising, and canvassing campaigns informed by state-of-the-art data and a deep understanding of their audiences. As the CNP members pursued their social policies, the Koch network advanced its economic plan. If the country was run by conservative theologians and the ultra-wealthy, there would be severe cutbacks in public education and public health, which is exactly what has happened. Non-educated voters are much easier to manipulate. The Koch brothers then attempted to discredit reporters who published critical accounts of their oil and gas operations. One example was Jane Meyer, whose book Dark Money revealed the Koch's disinformation campaigns on climate and environmental issues. The 2016 election clearly demonstrated how the mechanics of democracy could be manipulated to produce anti-democratic results. The tax reform enacted by Trump and the Republican Senate concentrated ever greater amounts in the hands of America's wealthiest individuals, driving inequality to the highest levels in 50 years. Trump remained a dependable ally, asking only for an audience for his narcissism and a free pass for business interests of the Trump brand. After Biden's victory in the 2020 election, members of the Council for National Policy exerted their influence and manipulated their followers to support Trump's lies concerning election fraud, thereby disrupting the United States' 200-year-old tradition of a peaceful transfer of power and undermining millions of Americans' faith in our democracy in the process. Evangelicals are ripe for manipulation, even if the end result is detrimental to their health, their well-being, and the future of their children. The CNP and its partners have little regard for the rights of minorities, its financial donors lack concern for social welfare, and its strategists have no respect for majority rule. If it is fully realized, their combination of theocracy and plutocracy, or rule by the religious conservatives and the wealthy, could result in a dystopia for all those who fall outside their circle. The challenge of modernity is to use technology and organizations not to exploit divisions, but to seek common ground. Can we ever recover from this? So what did you think about Ann Nelson's book, Shadow Network? Leave a comment below and let me know what you thought about this book. I hope you were able to better understand how the conservative long-term strategic plan developed from this short presentation. And again, if this was in any way helpful, drop me a super thanks. Until next time, stay curious. If you enjoyed this, support the channel in the link below. Please like and share this video and subscribe to this channel. This is TenOnReligion.